This is a fabulous introduction. Thank you very much. We're talking about repairing genes that cause disease. We're talking about perhaps changing populations, designer babies, changing embryos. These are complex, very complex questions. And Jennifer will guide us through the frameworks about managing risk, the governance of risk. Jennifer, the floor is yours.
Well, I also don't have the answers, but it's really a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the organizers, ISSP especially, for hosting me this semester, and also the Royal Canadian Institute. So my expertise is more on the agricultural and environmental applications of gene editing, an area that I've been studying the U.S. governance context for about past 20 or so years. And I've seen that evolve. So a lot of the things I say will draw upon that U.S. context and the kind of political and social landscape that I see there. But I think a lot of things are also applicable to the Canadian landscape, and I'm learning more and more about that every day. So it's a great pleasure to be here to learn about it. And I do think that we need to take both human and animal gene editing and plant gene editing, and we need to put it into more of a historical context. And Janet referred to this a bit about, the history of GM foods, GM animals, eugenics, which was, of course, a big deal in the United States, in racial eugenics, cloning, gene therapy, mishaps of gene therapy as well. There were some pretty key cases in the late 1990s. Now some of the issues with that have been sorted out, of course, but there's still worrisome risk on that side too. But also, even to think more broadly about putting it into the context of healthcare and who has access to healthcare and who has access to the most innovative and recent therapies. And also trust. How much do we trust our regulators? How much do we trust doctors, agricultural scientists, farmers? Whom do we trust? And then also just more broadly, a lot of the issues that I think arise and all the contentiousness about this topic really comes into this what is science and what is values distinction. And I'd like to just push back on that distinction a little bit. In our regulatory systems, whether we're talking about gene editing or in humans or animals or plant biotechnology more broadly, generally regulations are designed to really protect health in the environment, human health in the environment. And that's a really important focus, but often they're designed with a really narrow authority to look at direct health or environmental risk. And not necessarily for some of the indirect kind of more ecosystem-wide risks that may arise, or the unintended effects that we might come across with emerging technologies. One thing that you can think of that we're all familiar with is cell phones, for example. When cell phones were introduced into the market and widely disseminated, we didn't necessarily think about the impacts they would have on mental health or public health. And I don't mean that from a direct risk perception, like direct risk of having it next to your ear. There were some concerns about that initially, but recent articles in the New York Times and recent studies have indicated that there's a higher degree of mental health illness in teenagers, especially in the US. And they have attributed it to a linkage of how much they use social media and their cell phones. And so those are the kinds of things that we might not have necessarily anticipated. So some of these broader governance concerns come into play with not only the indirect or ecosystem risk, but also the social and ethical desirability of the technology, as well as envisioning what kind of world we want. And so there really is no space in the US for sure, and I'm also thinking in Canada as well, to have these discussions and to really take into consideration a variety of criteria and a variety of harms and benefits, not just the direct health and ecological toxicity or allergenicity that our regulations are so good at covering. And I think this is really going to be a really important issue when it comes to human gene editing, is who is allowed to have a voice in that debate. Is it just the people with the technical expertise in gene editing? or even toxicology and ecosystem science? Or are they the farmers in the field? Are they the stakeholders that live next door to where the mosquitoes are going to be released to combat malaria or Zika virus? And these are kind of the questions that I don't think we're as good at as addressing as a society. And I would argue that there are values inherent in any type of scientific endeavor. For example, the kinds of endpoints you choose to study, the motivations of your research, how you conduct your research, but especially in risk assessment, which is a particular domain of mine. Risk assessment, I'm a member of the Society for Risk Analysis, and we've said for a long time, and many people in that society say it's more art than science. But yet, we have a tendency in regulatory systems to only allow people who have that direct scientific expertise to interpret a risk assessment. And I'm not so sure that that's the right way to go. For example, if you're familiar with the dose-response curve, most of our studies are with high doses, high concentrations, looking for significant health effects. But really what we're more worried about are kind of these chronic low-level exposures over time. And that kind of data is really hard to get, and get it mainly from epidemiological studies, but even in the case of genetically modified foods, we haven't really necessarily been looking at that. So your data's up here, but you've got to draw that line down here is really where most human exposures are going to be. And there's a lot of assumptions that go into that type of modeling. There's a whole unit of the Society for Risk Analysis just for dose-response modeling, and they can go on for decades arguing about the right model to draw a dose-response curve. So that's uncertainty. That's what we call kind of the uncertainty in science. That has some values inherent in it. But safety, and this might be radical, is really a social construct entirely. So where you draw a safe level is not based on science. That's based on the values we bring into the discussion of how much risk we're willing to bear against the benefit. So science can inform decisions, but decisions cannot be based on solely science. And maybe I'm preaching to the choir here, but sometimes when I say this among a bunch of plant biotechnologists, in the US, they're like, oh, no, you can't say that. So I apologize if I'm preaching to the choir. So therefore, whose values counts? Some of the models for public deliberation and engagement with science, there's many models in the social science literature, in the policy literature. The problem is we're not tying up those models into formal decision making. So there's lots of academics and a lot of science museums in the US experimenting with different public deliberation techniques. But really all that information of what the public thinks and wants to see with regard to science and technology is not linked up to formal decision making. And I find that a bit problematic, especially when it comes to science that is highly unfamiliar, uncontrollable, and uncertain. Can we do it for everything? No. Things that we know pretty well, we can leave it to the experts, but areas that we don't know as well and that are so highly contentious and really bring out these ethical values, I do think that there are processes that we should be undertaking in both Canada and the US. So generally, people perceive risk on the basis of a variety of different kind of models or theories in the literature. And one is the features of the technology. So again, I mentioned controllability is a huge thing that people really appreciate. Controllability is a bit different in the medical area versus the agricultural or environmental area. And I want to just bring out that distinction a little bit when we talk about who has voice in governance. In the medical area, generally the patient has a good informed consent procedure with their doctor, with their clinician. And they are willing to bear the risk in order to gain the benefit. So that's kind of the unit of risk and benefit is a little bit more contained with medical applications. Unfortunately, with agricultural and food applications and environmental application, it's not often the person who's going to bear the risk who also reaps the benefit. And that makes a big difference for risk perception. And that's why I think these two areas are pretty distinct in some ways. It's also dependent on cultural worldviews. There's the cultural cognition theory, which is whether you have a more hierarchical or individualistic worldview versus an egalitarian or communal. And people fall into these different kinds of categories. And that becomes important too, that people will filter information according to their worldview. They will seek out information only that fits their worldview. And sometimes when they learn more about the science, sometimes they become more concerned about the risk. Which brings me to the idea that it's not, and I think many people have recognized this, it should not be a unidirectional, we need to educate the public. That's not necessarily going to work. But having this dialogue with them, we have to be prepared on the flip side to be responsive to their concerns. It's not enough to just have the dialogue, but to be responsive to the concerns as well, or else you might as well not even have the dialogue to begin with, because people get very frustrated in engagement. So, as far as I can tell, human gene editing and animal gene editing are very much still regulated on a direct risk according to safety. One of the safety issues I'll bring up with human gene editing, whether it's germline or somatic or ex vivo, outside the body or in vivo, is that there are these off-target edits you can get when you do gene editing. And they can vary depending on how you design the CRISPR machinery, or we used to use zinc finger nucleases and talons for gene editing. So they are precise, but they're not 100% precise. And researchers are getting better at lowering the off-target cutting rate and off-target error rate, but it still can be very high, and sometimes along the lines of 100%, like whenever you see a target cut, you'll see an off-target cut. But they're getting better and better at limiting that. So I look forward to hearing Janet's views on that as well. So off-target effects are really the biggest safety issue, but some of the more ethical issues are the line, what is the line between enhancement and disease treatment? Some ethicists talk about integrity or the wholeness of a person. Can they achieve their potential? Some ethicists talked about average. Can we bring them up to average abilities? And anything beyond that would be enhancement. Status of the embryo is really important for these debates. Some people do think that if you're going to edit away diseases or disabilities, that it could further stigmatize people who have disease and disabilities. So there's the way we think about disability, and would this make it even worse in that regard? And then I mentioned access and inequities. I know in the US context, healthcare is for the rich, essentially. Good healthcare anyway, and so people will have access who have the money to pay for it. So I'm not sure, I'll just say a few more things and then I'm going to stop. So I'm not sure if it'll come up later, but the policies in Canada and the US differ with regard to human gene editing right now. The Canadian policy is more of a legal restriction on no germline human gene editing, whereas the US policy is more of a funding restriction. So the federal government is not going to fund the FDA to review products if they use germline editing. So that can still take place, it could take place in fertility clinics if you're not going to sell the therapy afterwards in the US, whereas here there's a legal ban. So there are different policy mechanisms you can use to control or restrict human gene editing. I have more to say on the context of gene-edited animals, but maybe that'll come up in the discussion because I don't know how long I've been taking. So I think I'll stop there, but just to summarize, again, this distinction between science and values, maybe you can have a conversation about that later. Safety is a socially constructed topic. Public engagement and how you do that is really important, and where it feeds into is very important. Different policy tools to regulate or to oversee, and whether or not these wider ecosystem indirect risks and benefits or harms and benefits should be included in actual decision making about technologies and gene editing. I'm happy to talk about gene edited animals like this and genetically engineered animals and plants and gene drives after, if you all have any questions about that, because that's really my area of expertise. So thank you.